The frigid night air tore through the snow-laden trees and whistled across the barren yard, slicing through Marcus's threadbare coat as he braced himself against the porch railing, feeling every nerve on edge. Never, in all the punishing winters he had endured in these desolate woods, had he come across a spectacle so incomprehensible as the massive bear now standing just beyond his steps, its fur iced over in jagged clumps that glistened under the moon. The creature's eyes, gleaming like obsidian marbles in the moonlight, were fixed on Marcus with an uncanny intensity, conveying a desperate vulnerability that rippled through the wind. Each ragged breath the bear exhaled emerged in thick clouds, lit faintly by the glow from the cabin window, as if every inhalation cost it dearly in this punishing cold. Marcus's pulse pounded in his ears, for it seemed unreal that such a powerful beast would willingly approach a human dwelling in the dead of night. Instinct, along with the wilderness lore passed down to him, told him to bolt the door and let the bear freeze, yet he could not turn away from its trembling form. There was no roar. Instead, the animal swayed unsteadily, as if standing demanded its last reserves of strength, its plea as stark as the winter sky. A gust of wind hurled crystals of snow around the bear's paws, and Marcus watched in grim fascination as the creature lowered its head in resignation. He had heard stories of bears succumbing to merciless winters, but never had he imagined confronting such a raw testament to that fate. With painstaking caution, he moved 1 foot forward, the ice-crusted porch boards creaking under his weight, heart hammering at the risk. The bear exhaled a weary puff, so faint that Marcus felt a swell of empathy overshadowing his fear. Torn between the terror of the beast's might and the compassion tugging at his conscience, he couldn't abandon the creature to a lonely death. Overhead, thick clouds rolled in to devour the moonlight, promising a deeper cold that would seal any living thing's doom if left outside. The thought of leaving this wounded giant to freeze made his stomach clench in guilt he couldn't ignore. Slowly, he raised a shaking, gloved hand, palm outward, hoping this gesture would signal he meant no harm. The bear's gaze flicked to his hand, and Marcus tensed, bracing for an explosive reaction. Instead, the creature merely shuddered, dislodging bits of ice from its fur as it struggled to stay upright. He realized then that the bear's presence was a final gamble for survival, driven by hunger, injury, or both. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that true humanity often shows through in acts of mercy. Cautiously stepping down from the porch, he moved closer, each footfall magnifying the hush that enveloped the pines and drifts of snow. The usual chorus of nightlife was absent, replaced only by the faint scrape of wind and the soft sounds of their breathing. Though the cold stung mercilessly, Marcus pressed on, compelled by something greater than self-preservation. At arm's length he paused, then gently extended his fingers, nearly brushing the clumps of ice near the bear's muzzle. A surprising warmth radiated beneath those crusted patches, proof that the creature's life force still held on. Slowly, the bear let its heavy lids droop, as though surrendering what remained of its will to resist. Marcus withdrew his hand and gestured toward the door, his thoughts a chaotic clash of concern and doubt. Common sense told him that inviting a feral predator inside was lunacy, but his empathy was louder. The bear took a tremulous step, leaving deep paw prints in the snow that conveyed its precarious grasp on life. Marcus fought the instinct to recoil, certain that any display of panic might destroy their fragile accord. Inch by inch, he led the bear up the porch steps, muttering soft reassurances in a voice he barely recognized. The porch groaned under the animal's weight, and Marcus's pulse fluttered at the thought of it breaking. Yet the boards held, and within moments they stood at the threshold, where dim lamplight promised warmth. Marcus, shivering from cold and dread, searched the bear's eyes for any hint of aggression, finding only exhaustion. Swallowing hard, he rested his hand on the doorknob, half certain he was crossing into madness by letting the creature inside. To his amazement, the bear waited, making no move to push past him, as though honoring some unspoken etiquette. With a trembling breath, he nudged the door open, revealing a cramped interior lit by the glow of a small fire. The bear rumbled low in its chest, a noise laced with both caution and a strange acceptance of this new domain. Marcus slipped inside first, beckoning the animal to follow, keenly aware that this single step might append his entire world. With a raspy huff, the bear entered, bringing a blast of frigid air and its formidable presence into the tight room. As the door closed on the howling night, Marcus felt a shift in the air, a silent covenant forming between man and beast that neither could have foreseen. Marcus closed the door behind the bear, his trembling fingers fumbling with the latch as if sealing both their fates within these four wooden walls, while a draft of icy wind still clung to the threshold. He fought the urge to slam it shut too forcefully, keenly aware that any sudden noise could provoke the beast that now occupied his cramped entryway, its ragged breaths mingling with the dull crackle and occasional pop of the smoldering fire as dying embers struggled to remain alive. The cabin, which had once served as his solitary fortress against biting winters, now felt like an improbable refuge for a creature mighty enough to dismantle it if panic set in. With every hesitant shift of the bear's weight, the floorboards groaned, a discordant, creaking melody that underscored the thunderous, anxious tempo of Marcus's pulse, one that refused to quiet. Shadows flickered against the log walls, cast by the hearth's wavering flames, revealing the bear's mottled fur, partially thawed, partially encased in frost, and exposing the raw patches where ice had ravaged its flesh. Marcus swallowed the lump in his throat, his thoughts looping in dizzying circles as he reckoned with the enormity of taking a wild predator under his roof. A flood of questions gnawed at him. Should he attempt to find food, check for injuries he could somehow treat, or maintain a wide berth and simply rely on warmth to revive the creature's instincts for self-preservation? He was no wildlife rehabilitator. He possessed only the most rudimentary survival skills gleaned from a lifetime on the edge of civilization and the cautionary tales told by older hunters. Yet necessity had forced them together, a stark reminder that the divides between man and nature sometimes blurred in extreme circumstances. The bear tested the air with shallow breaths, the faint wheeze in its lungs betraying its continued struggle to shrug off the chill that threatened to cripple it from within. In a haphazard pile sat extra blankets and linens, once discarded as too frayed to be of any real comfort, now precious commodities that might shield a life from the fatal cold. Moving slowly, as though tiptoeing through a dream he feared to wake from, Marcus retrieved one of those tattered quilts, minding the constant vigilance in the bear's obsidian gaze. Draping the blanket across his arm, he edged closer, the silence filled by the soft hiss of melting ice whenever the bear's warmer fur touched the cool air. The creature let out a guttural sound, part rumble, part labored breath, a reminder that while it might be weakened, its primal power remained an ever-present threat. Mustering a gentle tone, Marcus spoke soothing words he barely believed himself, words of reassurance that might bridge the gap between them if the bear could sense his intent. With the same caution one would use to cradle a broken-winged bird, he extended the blanket, allowing the animal to sniff its worn fibers, a subtle invitation to accept help. A tremor coursed through the bear's frame, whether from cold or tentative relief, and it permitted Marcus to drape the fabric over its back, offering at least a semblance of comfort. Stepping back, Marcus realized how rigid his posture had been, every muscle coiled to spring away at the slightest sign of aggression. Another folded blanket he placed upon the wooden floor, creating a rudimentary cushion in case the bear decided to rest, though he could not guess how an animal this large might settle indoors. Outside, an intensified squall hurled sleet against the rattling shutters, an audible reminder of the unrelenting tempest that made their uneasy cohabitation necessary. Marcus felt a tremor of fear ripple through him, not just for himself but also for the creature whose life now hinged on his hospitality. In the tiny kitchen alcove, a half-empty kettle perched on an ancient stove, and he seized upon the idea of brewing some tea to soothe his frayed nerves, allowing fragrant steam to swirl and gently warm the confined space. Stirring the embers, he coaxed the fire to dance higher, each flicker sparking fleeting silhouettes that stretched grotesquely across the bear's hulking form. The beast sniffed at the air again, its nose twitching as it registered the aroma of soot, old wood, and the faint hint of dried herbs from Marcus's sparse provisions. Tentatively, Marcus rummaged through his cupboards, finding a tin of sardines and a few strips of jerky, hardly a banquet for such a formidable animal, but perhaps enough to stave off its worst hunger. He hesitated, imagining the risks. Feeding the bear might cement an unnatural dependency or embolden it to demand more, but failing to offer nourishment could waste the fragile opportunity to gain its trust. At last, he opened the tin, the pungent scent of oil and fish rising into the air, prompting the bear to swivel its head and stare with renewed interest. Carefully, he slid the plate across the rough-hewn floor, keeping his movements measured, acutely aware that any sudden gestures might trigger a defensive reaction. The bear's nostrils flared in evaluation, and with a raspy exhalation, it lapped at the sardine oil, pausing as if expecting some hidden catch in this improbable generosity. Marcus felt a rush of relief course through him at the sight, a subtle loosening of the dread that had knotted his chest. Nonetheless, his stomach churned with lingering unease, for he knew how quickly trust could unravel under the slightest provocation or misunderstanding. Adding a fresh log to the fire, he watched as sparks spiraled upward, sending a swirl of shadows dancing along the beams of the ceiling, transforming the cabin into a theater of flickering illusions. In the newfound warmth, the bear seemed to relax, its taut muscles loosening under the blanket, though the occasional twitch betrayed underlying tension or pain. Marcus wondered if it had frostbite or deeper wounds hidden beneath its thick pelt, and whether he dared attempt any form of treatment without risking a violent reaction. An hour seemed to pass in this strange, contemplative quiet, broken only by the howling wind and the crackle of fire, punctuated by the bear's occasional shift of posture. Exhaustion began to creep over Marcus, and he found himself leaning against the wall, eyelids heavy, yet unwilling to fully succumb to sleep while hosting a formidable, if subdued, predator. He reflected on the bizarre chain of events that had led to this moment, recalling the bear's plaintive gaze and the choice he'd made to open his door against all logic. The creature's presence felt like an omen, as though nature itself had sent a test of empathy to his doorstep, challenging him to redefine the boundaries of coexisting with the wild. For a brief instant, he imagined a future in which this night became an unlikely legend, one where man and bear forged an unbreakable bond in the midst of a deadly storm. That thought glimmered in his mind as he stoked the stove again, determined to keep both their hopes alive until the first rays of morning light revealed what fate had in store. Dawn arrived in a subdued hush, painting the cabin walls with a ghostly wash of pale light that seeped through snow-caked windows, creating an otherworldly glow in the cramped interior, each pane rimmed with spidery frost patterns. Although the storm had not fully relented, its raging fury had softened into a persistent, needling fall of icy flakes, tapping at the glass like restless spirits in search of warmth. Marcus, stiff from a night spent dozing fitfully against the wall, stirred to find the bear still huddled near the dying embers, its massive bulk curled beneath the blankets in an oddly domestic tableau. At some point during the darkest hours, the creature had rearranged its bedding, tugging the blanket around its shoulders with a surprising delicacy that belied its primal nature. Though the space separating them was scant, the unspoken gulf between man and beast remained profound, stretching like a silent canyon carved by eons of wary coexistence, a fragile alliance held together by necessity instead of genuine understanding. Marcus rose slowly, feeling every tendon protest the chill, and he fought the urge to groan lest the abrupt sound startle his formidable companion. When the bear opened its eyes, a fleeting glimmer of recognition passed over its weary features, as though it remembered the human who had offered shelter. For a fleeting moment, Marcus allowed himself the fantasy of maintaining this precarious sanctuary indefinitely, ignoring the harsh demands of the wilderness beyond his door. Reality, however, refused to be dismissed so easily, for supplies were limited, and the howling wind outside was a reminder of nature's relentless appetite for balance. Heart-pounding at the uncertain day ahead, he inched toward the small table where his meager rations lay scattered, mindful of how quickly they might vanish now that there were 2 mouths to feed. In the dawning light, he noticed the gaunt outlines of the bear's ribs, a stark testament to the severity of its ordeal, and felt a pang of urgency flare in his chest, a potent reminder that both his life and the bear's now seemed inextricably entwined. His own supplies, sparse though they were, might delay the bear's starvation, but he dreaded the inevitable question: what came next if the storm did not relent? He placed a new tin of sardines on a dented plate, nudging it slowly across the floor until it bumped against the edge of the makeshift bedding. The bear sniffed with the weariness of a creature caught between hunger and resignation, devouring the scant morsels as though performing a required duty rather than savoring a meal. While the bear ate, Marcus's thoughts flickered to practical concerns, finding more firewood, fixing the generator, and possibly hunting or scavenging if the weather afforded him any chance at all. Donning an extra layer from his trunk, he coughed softly to announce his movements, partly to reassure himself that he still inhabited a world of reason, partly to signal his departure to the watchful beast. The bear's gaze followed him, dark eyes reflecting something akin to a mute question, a silent query about whether the man would return. "I won't be long," Marcus murmured, feeling somewhat foolish as he spoke, uncertain if the words offered any real comfort. Stepping outside was like entering another realm entirely, the razor-sharp wind slicing at his cheeks, and the snow clinging to his boots in clumps. An ashen sky stretched overhead, heavy with lingering storm clouds, and the unbroken drifts underscored the isolation of this far-flung homestead. His plan, if it could be called that, was to ensure no further structural damage had occurred, gather more wood, and see if the generator might be coaxed into functionality for even a brief reprieve. Trudging around the corner of the cabin, he found snow piled to his waist, forcing him to plow a path with each labored step, cursing under his breath at the punishing conditions. The air stung his lungs, each inhale a reminder of how easily life could slip away in a land that offered scant forgiveness. Upon reaching the generator's lean-to, he discovered the partial collapse had worsened, burying crucial components under a slurry of slush and splintered wood. Time and tools would be needed to salvage it, but with the storm's unpredictability and his focus on the bear inside, he doubted he could spare enough effort today. Shaking his head, Marcus turned his attention to the stacked logs behind the cabin, pleased to find that some portion remained accessible despite the overnight drifts. He spent the better part of an hour wrestling chunks of wood from the snow's grasp, each armload heavier than the last, until his muscles burned and his breath came in ragged, uneven bursts that made his lungs feel scorched by the icy air. Beads of sweat chilled instantly on his brow, forming tiny crystals that pricked his skin with a biting sting, and he knew he had to return soon or risk hypothermia. With all the strength he could muster, he hauled a final bundle to the front door, kicking aside a crust of ice that threatened to seal the threshold shut. Pausing, he surveyed the untouched stretch of wilderness. No other tracks, no sign of scavengers, just a silent expanse of white that exuded both beauty and danger. Despite the numbness creeping into his fingers, a flicker of pride stirred in him for having survived thus far, but his pride was tempered by the knowledge that the greatest test still lay ahead. Entering the cabin, he braced himself for chaos, half expecting the bear to have reverted to animal instincts, scattering the meager furnishings in a panic. Instead, he found his visitor lying still, regarding him with guarded but seemingly calm eyes, as though waiting for his return to confirm the unspoken pact between them was still in effect. Marcus stacked the logs near the hearth, relishing the immediate relief of warmth that enveloped him, driving the chill from his bones. For a moment, he contemplated trying to examine the bear's injuries, but trepidation flooded him, for any clumsy attempt could spark the violence he had thus far miraculously avoided. The midday light filtered through the frosted windows, illuminating the cramped interior and highlighting every rough edge, every humble amenity that separated this cabin from the lethal void outside. Weariness tugged at him, but he dared not surrender to sleep fully, not with so many unknowns looming like shadows just beyond the threshold of his mind. Resting against the wall, he watched the bear's labored breathing and felt an inexplicable kinship growing in his chest, a curious blend of empathy and awe that defied logic. He wondered what his grandfather would make of this surreal entanglement. Would he applaud the compassion or scold the reckless gamble? Shifting his gaze to the shuttered window, Marcus realized that in facing the storm's savage truth, man and beast had become bound together in the quest for survival, a bond forged in winter's crucible and tempered by the fragile warmth of a single fire. The day wore on with agonizing slowness as Marcus wrestled with the grim reality of dwindling food stores and the question of how best to aid the bear's injuries, all while the ceaseless wind hissed against the cabin walls. From time to time, the creature would stir or release a muted rumble, yet it neither made any attempt to flee nor exhibited overt aggression, a silent truce that felt as delicate as a thin crust of ice over deep waters. Marcus clung to this tenuous piece like a lifeline, aware that it could be shattered by the slightest misstep in either his behavior or the bear's temper. Outside, the storm had eased from a raging blizzard to a perpetual gale, but it still battered the landscape with fierce gusts that made any journey beyond the property line a serious gamble. Tormented by restless thoughts, Marcus weighed the merits of venturing into the woods for game against the risk of frostbite and disorientation in the thick drifts that could conceal treacherous terrain. He had navigated these forests countless times in milder seasons, but doing so under these conditions, with a wounded bear dependent on him for sustenance, cast a relentless shadow of doubt over every decision. The possibility of leaving the bear alone gnawed at him, conjuring images of returning to find the cabin wrecked, or worse, discovering that the bear had wandered into the lethal cold, unable to endure any longer. Eventually, after much pacing and peering through the frosted windows for a break in the weather, Marcus resolved to brave a short excursion, hoping to set a few snares not far from the cabin's perimeter. Even a meager catch, a rabbit or a grouse, might stretch his provisions for another crucial day, should fortune choose to favor his desperate efforts. Layering on every scrap of warm clothing he possessed, he cast one last look at the bear, which lay with its muzzle on an oversized paw, giving no sign of protest or cooperation. The cold hit him the moment he stepped outside, a physical blow of sub-zero air that stole his breath and clawed at his exposed skin with merciless claws. The eastern fringe of the property, lined with a sparse stand of pines, offered the only real windbreak for miles, so he trudged in that direction, boots sinking into snow that came halfway to his knees. Each laborious step brought a fresh surge of icy air into his lungs, a chilling reminder that survival out here was never guaranteed for either man or beast. Periodically, he paused to listen for signs of life, a scuttling rodent, the call of a bird, but the forest remained eerily silent, as though holding its breath in solidarity with the frozen earth. The hush was unnerving, leaving him to question if all but the hardiest creatures had fled or perished in the storm's unyielding grasp. Eventually, he stumbled upon a small clearing where the wind was somewhat gentler, and he set 3 rudimentary snares, each a coil of wire placed near the base of evergreen trunks where animals might seek respite. His gloved fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled the knots, but he persisted, spurred on by the mental image of the bear's gaunt flanks and his own dwindling stock of canned food. The forest itself seemed indifferent, the thick snow already drifting around his ankles as though intent on burying any trace of his presence. Gazing across the white wasteland, Marcus felt a profound sense of isolation descend upon him, amplified by the knowledge that no one else was likely to pass this way for months. Despite his sense of urgency, he briefly scanned the horizon for any potential game, praying for a miracle in the form of a deer or even a lone fox, but the barren field of white mocked his hope. By the time he turned back toward the cabin, the wind had stiffened again, howling like a restless phantom hungry for any warmth it could devour. His return trek was a battle against biting gusts, and by the time the cabin's modest silhouette came into view, his limbs felt like inflexible blocks of ice, moved only by the force of will that sheer desperation provided. Staggering onto the porch, he stomped loose snow from his boots and paused to steady his trembling hands before re-entering the dim interior. Inside, he discovered the bear awake but calm, blinking slowly as though merely waiting in that murky space between sleep and vigilance. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, relieved to find no catastrophic disaster had unfolded during his brief absence. After shrugging off his layers, he replenished the fire with fresh logs, the resulting flare of orange light casting dancing shadows that made the cramped interior feel marginally more expansive, as though the dancing light created an illusion of space in their tiny haven. As warmth seeped back into his fingertips, he contemplated the next step, eyeing the bear's ragged fur and wondering if he dared attempt a rudimentary inspection for frostbite or infection. Each scenario played out in his mind, a sudden snap of jaws if he probed too far, a flinch of pain that turned lethal in a heartbeat. Yet he couldn't simply ignore the patches of ice-burned flesh, not when the creature had placed its survival in his reluctant care. Summoning courage, he picked up a battered lantern to improve visibility and approached the bear in small increments, speaking in hushed tones as though consoling a frightened pet. The animal rumbled low in its chest, a warning or perhaps mere discomfort, yet it made no move to attack, allowing Marcus to kneel and examine the worst patches of fur. The stench of old blood and melted ice tinged the air, causing his stomach to roil with sympathy and a pang of guilt that he was so ill-equipped for such a task. Dipping a piece of cloth into lukewarm water, he dabbed gently at those stubborn, frozen lumps that clung to tufts of fur like parasitic growths. Despite obvious discomfort, the beast tolerated his clumsy ministrations, occasionally twitching or letting out a subdued growl that stopped Marcus's heart each time. Bit by bit, he chipped away at the icy clumps, revealing raw patches of skin where frostbite lurked, though thankfully none appeared irreversibly blackened or gangrenous. The toll on Marcus's own energy reserves was not insignificant. Sweat trickled down his neck, and his muscles burned from maintaining a crouch, all while bracing for sudden violence. Finally, he set the cloth aside, wiping his brow with the back of his arm, surveying the bear's still ragged but slightly improved coat. A part of him wondered if his efforts were merely delaying the inevitable, yet he felt a flicker of satisfaction at having tried to ease another's suffering, even if that other could easily end his life with a single swipe. Leaning back on his heels, he locked eyes with the bear, and in that silent exchange, he caught a glimpse of exhaustion, resolve, and an emotion that might have been gratitude, or some primal echo of relief at not being abandoned to the merciless cold. As the wind rattled the shutters, Marcus realized they were both prisoners of the storm, bound by a fragile alliance that would test the very limits of courage, compassion, and the improbable grace that nature sometimes bestows upon the desperate. Afternoon light dimmed behind the swirling curtain of snow, casting the cabin's interior into a somber twilight that left both man and bear wrapped in flickering half-shadows. Marcus paced in tight circles beside the fireplace, torn between the urge to take bolder action, perhaps searching for bigger game, or risking a longer trek to the far side of the forest, and the gnawing instinct to remain indoors. Each time he glanced at the bear, he was reminded of the precarious balance they had struck, one that could dissolve into chaos if either of them made a rash move. The creature lay on the blankets, occasionally licking at the areas Marcus had cleaned, as if it recognized the tentative healing that had begun under his novice care. Outside, the storm had not abated so much as changed its form, shifting between powdery flurries and icy pellets that pinged off the window panes with a frantic rhythm. Hunger gnawed at Marcus's belly. He rummaged through his cupboards and grimaced at the dwindling supplies, realizing with dread that starvation was no longer a distant threat. A few cans of beans, some crackers, and half a bag of rice comprised his remaining staples, none of which would sustain a massive bear for long. Anxious to do something constructive, he melted snow in a pot over the fire, hoping to at least keep water readily available for both himself and his unlikely guest. From time to time, the bear watched him with that same impenetrable gaze, neither friendly nor hostile, as though weighing the man's every choice. Resolved to try another short foray outside, Marcus donned his gear and opened the door to a blast of cold so intense it stung his eyes and stole his breath. He pressed forward regardless, determined to inspect the snares he had set, though he doubted any creature small enough to be caught could survive these brutal conditions. Each step through the drifting snow felt like wading in quicksand, and the gale threatened to topple him more than once as he trudged along the faint impression of his earlier tracks. At the first snare, he found nothing but a mound of fresh snow. At the second, the wire had been knocked askew by shifting drifts. Desperate hope urged him to check the third, but it too lay empty, a silent rebuke from a forest that refused to yield its resources on this pitiless day. He gathered what little energy he had left to reset the loops, though he hardly believed in their success, then paused to survey the tree line for any sign of movement. The wind shrieked through the branches, creating a dissonant orchestra of creaks and groans that seemed to mock his efforts. Head bowed against the storm's relentless fury, he turned back, lungs burning with each ragged breath, frost clinging to his eyelashes. Upon reaching the cabin, he found the doors slightly ajar, an alarming sight that sent a jolt of panic through him. Had the bear tried to leave, or had the wind forced it open? Slamming it shut behind him, he surveyed the interior with a hammering heart, relief flooding in when he spotted the bear still curled on the blankets, no sign of struggle. He realized, with a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold, just how vulnerable they both were in this tenuous arrangement. Casting aside his snow-caked coat, Marcus stoked the fire, coaxing flames to life with trembling fingers and a weariness that penetrated to his core. The thought crossed his mind that perhaps the bear needed more than idle sympathy and scraps of food. It needed a deeper warmth, a sense of true safety. Yet he wondered how a human could provide such a thing to a wild animal. Even so, he gathered more of his threadbare blankets and, with quiet determination, padded across the floor to lay them near the bear, forming a thicker bed that might ward off the lingering chill. Though it had not eaten in several hours, the creature showed no aggression, only shifting its weight with a slight grunt of acknowledgement. Marcus's own hunger roared in the pit of his stomach, so he cooked a modest meal of rice and beans, watching with apprehension as the pot bubbled over the fire, every grain precious in these uncertain times. He allowed himself a single portion, saving the rest for the next day, an act of rationing that made the meal taste all the more vital. The bear, sensing the aroma, sat up slightly, but made no move to approach, as though resigned to the fact that this was not its food to claim. Feeling a pang of guilt, Marcus poured a bit of water into a bowl and set it beside the bear, wishing he had something more substantial to offer. Outside, the wind battered the walls, and he imagined the world beyond as a swirling void of white, indifferent to the desperation unfolding within this fragile haven. Once he finished eating, he tried to busy himself by reorganizing his supplies, though the sight of how little remained threatened to erode his thin shield of hope. The bear watched him all the while, occasionally blinking, as though it recognized the gravity of their shared predicament. Marcus found himself talking to it in low, steady tones, confessing to raw fear and exhaustion he usually kept locked inside, as if sharing the burden might somehow lessen it. Perhaps it was madness to speak so freely to an animal that could not respond, but the act of voicing his anxieties brought a semblance of catharsis. Light dimmed further, and the interior took on a claustrophobic darkness broken only by the flicker of embers that danced across the timbers. Marcus leaned against the wall, knees drawn up, scanning the cabin's meager contents and the silent bulk of the bear, pondering if this alliance would last another day, let alone another week. Tension coiled in his shoulders as he considered the severity of the storm. If it persisted, they would both face starvation or worse, and if it ended, could the bear survive re-entering a world that offered no mercy? The questions circled in his mind, relentless and unanswerable, until a sudden thump drew his attention, the bear shifting to rest its head on its paws with a low sigh. In the flickering glow, the animal looked strangely peaceful, even dignified, and Marcus felt a rush of unexpected admiration for its tenacity. Gingerly, he slid a bit closer, not close enough to intrude on its space, but near enough to sense the heat emanating from its colossal body. Two survivors bound by a mutual need. The storm howled beyond the cabin walls, an unremitting reminder of their peril. Yet here in the dancing shadows, man and beast clung to a fragile bond, each hoping the other might be the key to making it through another night. A restless night gave way to a pale dawn, and as the first threads of weak sunlight ventured through the ice-laden windows, Marcus stirred to the sound of soft panting. The bear had dragged itself closer to the now smoldering fire during the night, its flank rising and falling in shallow, laborious breaths that made Marcus's heart constrict with concern. He reached out cautiously, pressing a tentative hand to the animal's shoulder, feeling the coarse texture of half-frozen fur and the solid muscle beneath it. The bear blinked, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, Marcus thought he glimpsed a plea in those dark eyes, a wordless request for something more than mere survival. Steeling himself, he rose to his feet, certain that if he did not act soon, both of them would be doomed by dwindling supplies and the relentless cold that refused to relent. With the storm still raging, hunting larger prey remained a near impossibility, but he could at least search more thoroughly for any source of nourishment, berries, bark, anything that might provide a shred of sustenance. Determined, he donned his warmest gear again, forcing himself not to dwell on the suffocating fear that one misstep in the wilderness could seal his fate. Before stepping outside, he turned to the bear, murmuring, "I'll be back," hoping that whatever slim bond they shared might keep the creature from despair. The cabin door groaned against the drifts pressed against it from outside, and Marcus had to shoulder his weight into the wood just to pry it open enough to squeeze through. A landscape of frozen desolation greeted him, an unbroken sea of white stretching between the tree lines, with icy gusts slicing across the clearing. Clutching a small hatchet, he plowed forward, eyes squinting against the glare off the snow, searching for any stray branches or hidden pockets of vegetation that might remain beneath the crust. His breath came in heavy puffs, crystallizing almost instantly in the air, and each step was a minor victory against the biting cold that sought to devour him. Time lost meaning as he scoured the margins of the property, venturing farther than before, forging a path through drifts that tugged relentlessly at his legs. The pines stood silent, limbs burdened with ice, occasionally dropping a sheet of frozen needles in a muted crash that broke the otherwise deafening hush. Straining his ears, he listened for any flicker of life, a squirrel, a bird, but encountered nothing beyond the lonely moan of the wind swirling through frosted boughs. At last, he stumbled across a cluster of dormant bushes, their branches thick with ice, but they hinted at the possibility of dried berries clinging to their twigs. Carefully, he chipped away at the frosty coating, plucking a handful of shriveled, dark specks that once might have been edible fruit. Doubt gnawed at him. Would these even be safe to eat, or had the extreme cold rendered them toxic? But desperation spurred him onward. Gathering what he could, he wrapped the meager findings in a scrap of cloth, mind whirling with the realization that even if these were edible, they would barely feed one person, let alone a starving bear. Pressing on, he used the hatchet to chop at the bark of a downed tree, hoping to uncover insects or nutrient-rich cambium beneath the outer layers. Splinters flew in a ragged spray as he hacked and pried, finally revealing a sliver of softer wood dotted with tiny grubs that wriggled half-frozen under the sudden exposure. Marcus grimaced in revulsion, yet he recognized this might be the last source of protein they had for days, and he scraped them into a tin with trembling hands. By the time he finished, his fingers felt numb despite the thick gloves, and he realized he could push himself no further without risking collapse. Staggering back toward the cabin, he imagined the bear's reaction to the paltry offering he carried, a few shriveled berries and a scattering of barely living insects. Yet it was all he had to give, and a grim hope fluttered in his chest that perhaps the bear's wild instincts might drive it to eat what a human would find unthinkable. Upon arrival, he all but fell through the doorway, snow tumbling in behind him as he forced the door shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged the air in white bursts. The bear raised its head at once, nostrils flaring at the new scents Marcus brought in, and he wasted no time in hastily spreading out his pitiful harvest. Clumps of frost clung to his beard, and his teeth chattered so violently he could barely speak, but he managed to say, "It's not much, but it's something." With wary curiosity, the bear sniffed the mixture of shriveled berries and writhing grubs, giving a soft huff that might have been disdain or merely acknowledgement. Marcus braced himself for rejection, but to his relief, the creature licked at the morsels, swallowing them in a single gulp that spoke of desperate hunger. Shuddering with cold, Marcus lit another scrap of tinder in the fireplace, coaxing the embers back into flames that shed enough warmth to keep him conscious. His arms and legs ached from trudging through the wilderness, Yet an unspoken bond fueled him, a glimmer of resolve that said, if the bear could keep fighting, so would he. He offered the animal a small bowl of snowmelt water, watching as it drank slowly, its breath ragged but determined, an echo of his own unbroken will. Darkness threatened the corners of his vision, and he realized that if he didn't rest soon, the fight in him would dissipate, leaving them both stranded in futility. Summoning his last reserves of strength, he huddled closer to the fire, propping himself against the wall, grateful that the bear made no move to displace him. Outside, the storm roared on, a relentless adversary that neither man nor beast could fully conquer. Yet inside, they clung to life in defiance of all odds. Marcus closed his eyes, surrendering to the exhaustion that pulsed through his veins, a silent vow in his mind to wake and continue this fragile alliance for one more day. The bear settled onto its side, chest rising and falling with each labored inhale, as if it too recognized the razor-thin margin between survival and surrender. In the flickering firelight, man and bear shared an unspoken prayer that the storm would abate, that dawn might bring a thaw or a stroke of fortune to tip the balance in their favor. As the embers glowed and the wind howled, they rested in a unity forged from sheer necessity, each breath a testament to the will to live, and each heartbeat an echo of hope that, come morning, they would still be alive to greet the uncertain day.